Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Youth Vote UK Question Time. It's fantastic to see so many of you here this evening. My name is Alex Kens, and I'm the CEO of the Youth Vote UK. It's amazing that we have so many people with us this evening. The team have been working hard on this event for some time, so really good that you could join us. The Youth Vote was set up a few years ago to really try and engage young people in politics. And we've worked hard both at local and national level to ensure that young people feel like they have a kind of voice in society and voice in democracy. So really, thank you for joining this evening, and hopefully you can be supporting us moving forward. Before we begin, there are just a few things that I'd like to mention. Naturally, we do have some housekeeping rules for this evening. The Youth Vote UK won't be tolerating any homophobic language, any racism, any hate speech, and if you do any of these things, we will be removing you. So please try and keep this cordial, try and keep this respectful. Everyone, wants to have a really good event. So I will be going to audience members throughout the event. If you do have anything to say, please raise your hand and we will try and come to you. If you want to get involved this evening, we will be putting the hashtag into the chat. So keep an eye on that. And anything that you want to ask, put on Twitter, or raise your hand and we will try to get to you. We have a fantastic panel this evening, which I would like to introduce now. Professor David Runciman, who's a professor of politics at the University of Cambridge, also author of The Politics of Good Intentions and is the host of the podcast Talking Politics. Calvin Robinson, senior fellow at the Policy Exchange, is also a columnist and commentator at the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Guardian, and Talk Politics, to name a few. Zarah Sultana, Labour MP for Coventry South, has strong opinions on inequality, social justice and climate emergency. He was part of the 2019 intake of new MPs. Munira Wilson, Member of Parliament for Twickenham and the Lib Dem spokesperson for health, wellbeing and social care. Andrew Bowie, the Scottish Conservative Party politician and Member of Parliament for West Aberdeenshire and Kincardine. Jamie Greene, who's the MSP for the West Scotland region and Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, and Ross Greer, Green Party MSP for the West Scotland region, and was the youngest ever MSP elected at 21 in the 2016 election. So a fantastic panel, and thank you very much for being with us this evening. We will move on to our first question this evening. We had a lot of questions raised by lots of young people before this event. Naturally, obviously, we wanted to talk about the most pressing issues, and one of the most raised topics that we had was around tuition fees and mental health. So the question to our panel is, do you think students are justified in wanting reduction or partial reimbursement of their tuition fees? We will kick off with Calvin Robinson. Calvin, your thoughts on students and tuition fees at this time?
I assume you're talking because of the COVID situation and the different provisions universities have provided over lockdown. I think there is a case to be made. I myself am back at university reading theology at Oxford, and I haven't had the same experience that I would have wanted in normal times. I think, as provided that the university is still teaching and you still have a learning experience, there is a case to be made that the money is being spent on your education. But if it's not the full experience that you want or that you applied for when you wanted to join the university, then there is a case to be made for getting a partial reimbursement. But I think the government has said that as long as the course is still fit for purpose, or the teaching and learning is still fit for purpose, that the university don't have to repay you anything. It's a tricky situation. I think we want universities to remain open and we want to keep them going. And we know that they are very massively underfunded and struggling as it is. If we take away all of that money, suddenly a lot of universities are going to collapse and we won't have any to apply to in the coming years. So we do have to have balance in this situation. But at the same time, I understand that a lot of students are disappointed in the experience that they're getting. But as long as you're coming out of it with, knowledge and expertise, it won't be the same as it would have been 2 years ago, but as long as you come out of it with something, I suppose it's better than nothing.
Yeah, thank you very much, Calvin. Zarah Sultana, naturally you have two universities in your constituency, so I'm interested about your thoughts on this.
To all the students on the call, firstly, I just want to extend my solidarity to you, because your treatment this year and the past year by the government and by your universities has been pretty disgraceful. Because as Alex mentioned, and Calvin actually, students were encouraged to go to university. You were promised this normal experience in a pandemic, which was never going to be realized. And students found themselves being locked in their accommodation, and then also told that they shouldn't be going to their accommodation as per COVID rules, but then were still being charged for it. And it's estimated that around £1 billion students have paid for accommodation that they can't use. That's disgraceful, and it's totally unfair. And I agree that rent for unused accommodation should be refunded, and students shouldn't have to pay fees this year. But I also believe that we shouldn't be paying fees this year, we shouldn't be paying fees next year, we shouldn't be paying fees altogether, because at the heart of it, higher education and education as a whole is a public good. We all benefit from it. And as someone who went to university in 2012 and was hit by that tripling of tuition fees by the Lib Dem and Conservative coalition government, this is something I feel very passionate about. And I was able to use my student loan statement in Parliament to raise that issue. So I agree that we need to be refunding students this year, but also make that case for higher education as free education for forever, essentially.
Thanks, Zarah. Munira Wilson.
Thanks, Alex, and thank you to you and all of the team for inviting me to be part of this panel today. It's great to see so many young people on the call today. So with regards to the pandemic and tuition fees, I mean, I completely understand, having spoken to a number of students in my own constituency, the disappointment and how so many of you feel so shortchanged because, as Calvin said, you've not been able to have the university experience that you expected, that many of us had the benefit and the privilege of having. So, but I have also spoken to universities. For instance, I've got St Mary's University in my own constituency here in Twickenham, and Roehampton just up the road, and talking to the vice chancellors there. The challenge for universities to be able to provide some level of reimbursement is because they are continuing to teach, albeit remotely, and therefore the costs are still being incurred. And therefore it would be, in terms of their own finances, you know, it's not so much for some of the top tier universities, but some other universities are really struggling to keep their head above water financially. So I think it should fall to the government. The government has rightly stepped in to protect jobs through this pandemic by spending billions on the furlough scheme that we, the Liberal Democrats, strongly support, and a number of other schemes to support people. But young people in general, whether they were school age or university age, to my mind, have been largely forgotten about in this pandemic. And I would like to see the government stepping in to be able to support some reimbursement of fees, and also for student living costs. What has been offered so far has been limited, and I do think this is an area of real inequality in terms of how they've treated different sectors of society through this pandemic. And remember, to my mind, young people, whether they're children, whether they're students, have made some of the biggest sacrifices in order to be able to protect the most vulnerable, yet I think they haven't necessarily been served so well by the different support packages. So I would definitely call on the government to step in to provide that finance, because I don't think many universities can afford to provide the reimbursement themselves. Thanks,
Munira. Jamie Greene, obviously, is Shadow Education Secretary in Scotland. Naturally, obviously, fees are different there, but I imagine from a kind of English perspective, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we obviously, those of us north of the border will talk about a slightly different structure. Further and higher education is entirely devolved to the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. I'm in a slightly unusual situation, and I'm a member of a party who's in government south of the border, but is in opposition in Scotland. So we have a slightly different role up here. My role is chiefly to shadow the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, who is an SNP member for the Scottish Government. And I think I'm not sure if there are any SNP members of Parliament or the Scottish Parliament on this call. So I think, to be fair to them, I'll give my comments in a fairly constructive way, but I just want to point out for the record that these are devolved issues. Of course, students in Scotland don't pay tuition fees. That's a political decision taken by the Scottish Government. That is also a position which I support. Now, that hasn't always been the case. From my party, we historically have taken a position that we need to properly fund universities, and that's very difficult to do. But it's fair to say that we've taken on board feedback from students in Scotland, and I'm very proud to say that I now believe that in Scotland, I don't think students should pay tuition fees. But that's really not, that's kind of half the story. The other half of the story is, of course, how you fund further and higher education. And that's the real challenge we have in Scotland. And I think whatever your politics or in Scotland, you have to accept that institutions, universities, colleges are really struggling at the moment in Scotland. So when the government in Scotland says that these places are fully funded, it's simply not true. And in effect, it's costing universities money to deliver the education, because the money that they get from the government to cover the cost of tuition fees doesn't meet the cost of delivering the education. And that really presents a day-to-day cash flow problems for universities. Now, up until now, I've been chatting to Scottish universities a lot recently. And of course, they've been making up the shortfall by charging students from England, I'm afraid to say, and also outside of the EU. But also they've been making a lot of their money from accommodation, from conferencing, from catering, and also from, commercialising the research and development functions. But of course, the events of the last year put them in a very difficult position. Our colleges and universities are in dire straits. We know that a number of them are almost hitting the wall. And certainly a lot of them are running out of money quite quickly, almost to the point where they're either cutting staff numbers, restructuring staff contracts, or even cutting courses, as we know has been the case in Scotland, where the amount of college places is actually reduced. So that's putting in a huge amount of pressure on our universities. So it'd be very easy to say, well, they must give something back to students. But in doing so, we might actually put some of them below the waterline. Of course, I think perhaps something we would agree on in the political spectrum here in Scotland is the issue of rent refunds. I certainly support the concept of issuing rent refunds. It's not fair that students have been asked to stay at home and stay away from their places of residence and not been able to use them. So I think in one sense, I'm going to maybe end my comments by saying that I agree with Zarah, because she's really angry at the government in England and I'm really angry at the government in Scotland. They just happen to be two different governments run by two different parties. So we're maybe in a position of a similar position here, where we're both angry at the government of the day in our own respective administrations. So, I mean, I think the other thing I want to agree with Zarah on, I think off the bat, is the way young people have been treated this past year. I don't know what it's been like not south of the border, but I have been listening to it on the radio and watching the news. But the idea we were locking up students in the middle of the pandemic, not letting them out to see friends. There was a ban on them at one point and from going to the pub when pubs were actually opened. And they should not be treated differently from the rest of the population. I mean, it's been absolutely obscene the way that young people have been demonised and stigmatised this past year, despite the fact that most of them have been trying their best to do the right thing in very difficult circumstances. So I hope that sets maybe a scene for the rest of the conversation. I hope we can have a constructive debate about education as well, which is my real passion in politics.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jamie. Professor Runciman, clearly, obviously, you'll have, heard from students, on your own campus about this issue. I appreciate that you might have a conflict of interest here, but just kind of... No, I don't. Okay, well, just in terms of your thoughts, like...
You call me Professor, call me David.
Okay.
I mean, I think, it was a yes or no question. I mean, I think there's a strong case that the answer is yes, but I think there's a danger that if the focus is all on the past year, the politics gets really difficult, because for all the reasons we've heard, students have had a really terrible time. And I know this is a question sort of also about mental health. It's been grim for all sorts of reasons. And it's also true, as we've heard, that universities are really anxious about cash flow, some of them about survival. That makes for a really testy political situation. And yet, I think it is time that tuition fees was revisited as a political issue in a broader context. And there are two reasons, I think, to be, if you want to hope that tuition fees come back to the centre of politics, to be hopeful that there's a kind of longer term conversation to have, one of which is universities are going to have to change the way they operate. I mean, coming out of this, a lot of what we have done as universities this past year is not going to change, right? We've discovered new ways of teaching. We've had to be more flexible. We've got to be able to rethink what it is to give a good teaching experience. We're not just going to go back. I used to teach 200 students in a sort of both sweaty and unheated lecture theatre with everybody coughing on everyone else. There's no way under any conditions we're going back to that. So let's at least think that we're going to rethink some of higher education. And this is an opportunity to make the politics of this constructive again. You know, tuition fees is both associated with terrible effects for the Lib Dems and then also now with the pandemic. But there's got to be a wider conversation about how to make universities viable economically and how to give students a better experience. And then the other reason I think, I mean, this touches on what Jamie was talking about, we are entering a period of British politics where issues of potential Scottish independence, but at least the debates around that, the future of the union, the last year has really highlighted how important devolved government is in this country now and how much difference there is. So that gives an opportunity to have an argument about different ways of doing it, which we haven't had to this point. So I think the danger here would be to think this is about what's happened in the last year. I think it's about much, much more than that.
Thank you very much, David. Ross Greer, your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I mean, as Jamie said, obviously the situation's different in Scotland. The overwhelming majority of students here don't pay fees, but some do. As Jamie said, students from the rest of the UK, international students do, and I think they are absolutely deserved a refund, because students across the UK were essentially sold a lie over the summer last year that everything was going to be totally normal. They would have a normal freshers experience if they were coming into first year. And that just wasn't the case. I mean, it was a catastrophic failure, and it should have been really obvious to get testing in place for students arriving on university campuses across the country, and the lack of a test and trace infrastructure and different failures, because it's different test and trace systems in the different parts of the UK, but those different failures, they made a situation far, far worse than it should have been. Now, particularly for universities in Scotland, though it's true across the UK, the desire to get students into accommodation was an overwhelmingly financial one from university management. Accommodation is incredibly lucrative for them. Now, there's a financial need for unis across the country, but as Jamie highlighted, there's a particular need in Scotland because tuition fees for Scottish students are nominally covered by the Scottish government, but what they fund actually comes to less than the cost of teaching. So there's a real push to make up that money through international student fees and through accommodation. What we ended up in, though, even a couple of months before that, the tail end of the previous year, was a situation where you had students trapped in accommodation, or not trapped in it, but trapped paying for accommodation that they'd left, because the March of last year, folk went home when the pandemic started, but had to continue paying for accommodation into May or June. Now, I'm not sure what the tenancy laws are in the rest of the UK, but here in Scotland, up until last year, student tenancies were totally different to every other kind of tenancy, and you couldn't actually end it early. So we had students in a situation where both at the end of that year, but also the current academic year, thinking, well, I don't want to pay a year's worth of rent for accommodation I might only be in for a couple of months. And the Greens were able to get that change. We had two big emergency pieces of legislation in Scotland. One of the things that the Greens added to it was to change that so that students could actually terminate those tenancies. So students are able to get out of their tenancy with a month's notice now, but there's a lot of folk who still deserve rent rebates. And we also need to look at the wider issue of the effect it's had on academic performance. Unis across the country should have adopted a no detriment policy. No one should have ended up with a worse grade as a result of the pandemic than what they were achieving before that. And a lot did, but plenty of others didn't. There was this real lack of consistency. And that had a really unequal effect. If you were a mature student with kids at home who were at home, you were having to do their remote learning and you're studying. If you're a student who didn't have a good broadband connection at home, didn't have the equipment to connect, massively, massively unequal effect of the pandemic, which is why no detriment policies were and still are absolutely crucial.
Thanks very much, Ross. And finally, Andrew, Bowie, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thank you very much to all the Youth Vote UK for organising this. An incredible, you're doing so much to engage young people in politics, and it is a generation which has been affected like no other by the decisions that we've had to take, rightly take over the past year to lock down, to protect the NHS, to preserve life in this country. But as the Vice Chairman for Youth of the Conservative Party, I've spent a lot of the past year talking to young members of the Conservative Party. And it strikes me that in answer to your question, the answer has to be an overwhelming yes. Students are within their right to be angry and to be demanding some sort of recompense from their higher education institution or their accommodation provider. Unfortunately, the situation, as has been explained by just about every other speaker this evening, is incredibly complicated. Higher education institutions are very pressed for cash at the present time. They're under severe pressure, like every other institution is in the country, for reasons that don't need going into tonight. But for a generation that has seen their student life change beyond all recognition, the jobs market completely collapse, the chance of getting onto the housing ladder seeming more distant than ever, with the average deposit of now 25%, with life chances, the opportunity to travel and explore just disappearing in front of their eyes. I can't say anything other than young people should be feeling aggrieved and should be asking for some of what they put out to invest in their education back. I think we need to have a long, hard look at how we deal with funding higher education in this country as we move forward. There's no doubt that the last year has provided a real jolt in terms of how we think about delivering higher education in the United Kingdom. And what I think a lot of universities will have to realise is that there's going to come a time when some people are going to start thinking, well, why am I paying upwards of £9,000 a year to attend a seminar on Zoom from my own house in insert name here, from the university that I'm paying £9,000 for, when I can watch a lecture streamed live from Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge, a university which I could never get access to, but now I'm seeing their lectures for free online. So there's going to come a time when people are going to start deciding, well, is it worth the money just to be sitting taking things through an online experience? So I think we're going to have to really look at how we fund higher education in this country. It's not true. I mean, as Ross and Jamie made clear, people say that higher education is free in Scotland. That's not the case. The higher education institutions in Scotland are nearly solely reliant on fees paid from English and international students, and they have been very much cheated out of their year this year. So yeah, I don't really have very much more to add than what everybody else has said, other than I do think that there's going to come a time when we have to look seriously at how we fund higher education in the United Kingdom. And I can understand and have sympathy with everybody who feels aggrieved at the situation they've been put in this year. And more than tuition fees, because you are still receiving tuition, more than tuition fees, the situation regarding accommodation and getting rent rebates or whatever back from those people who have been providing a service that has not been used for the whole year. I think that is something that we should look very, very sympathetically on in terms of being able to deliver for the young people. I mean, for goodness sake, as I said, the generation that has been harmed more than any other due to the actions we've taken, surely it is incumbent on us to give something back and look at how we can deliver that, if nothing else.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you very much, Andrew. So we will go to the audience now. I've seen some raised hands. We'll go to Naveed first. Naveed, if you want to, we can
Hello everybody, my name is Naveed. I'm the chairman for the Conservative Muslim Forum in Scotland. My question is this, that people from ethnic minority backgrounds have been affected more so than the general population due to us having difficulty accessing higher education, lower attainment levels. We come from sort of more impoverished backgrounds. Is there going to be a system in place where we will be able to make up for the lost time in education in colleges and universities throughout the summer? Is there plans in place for that? Or is it just going to have to be a sort of a like it and lump it? As we all know, online education has been there as a support mechanism, but it's been nowhere near the level of attainment that students could have got to. Now, students who are A+ in primary school, high school, they tend to do fantastically, even when the cards are stacked against them at university. But the students who have just barely made it, just got the results to just barely get into the courses, what can we do for those students, the ones that are going to be most affected? Because that is the difference of them being able to finish those courses and actually going on to further education or going into the job market, or actually just feeling behind and leaving without any qualifications whatsoever. And a lot of our colleagues out there touched upon the financial implications of all this. Thank you.
Thanks, David. There's a lot to unpack there. We are short for time. Does anyone from the panel want to jump in to answer Navid's question?
I can. I can't see anyone else. Yeah, I think that's a really important question about working class people and people from marginalised backgrounds who have been disproportionately hit, especially within the context of secondary school, primary school, college and university. And I think while we're looking at issues affecting these groups in the context of the pandemic, these issues aren't just 1 year old or 2 years old. These are issues that span decades. When we look at the funding cuts that have hit schools, the way teachers are pressurised and work in pressurised environments around marking, the kind of culture we have within our education system. Of course, I can only speak on the experience within England. It's a very over-tested, over-examined system where we put a lot of value on exams. And this is an opportunity for us to think beyond examining people. And I think that's a broader conversation to have about what are we getting from our education system? Is it literally just a factory belt, kind of conveyor belt system for people to pass exams, or are we teaching young people how to be critical, how to look at the world and how to be creative? So I think that's a really important point. On the point about students going to university, I think universities really should explore more compassionate kind of processes where you look beyond exams and you look at, the profile of a student. Where are they coming from? What kind of experiences do they have? What are they passionate about? And I think we need to put more emphasis on people and move away from some of the kind of more rigid structures that we're so used to following.
Thanks, Zarah. We will move on to the next question. Navid, thanks for your question. I'm just conscious of time and want to ensure that we get through as many questions as possible. So, there was a lot to unpack there. Interestingly, we did talk about kind of young people's job prospects. And one of the questions that we did have from lots of young people is obviously, given the fact that 7% of under 25s have been made redundant, under 25s are extremely likely to be furloughed, far more likely to be furloughed than any other age group. The question to the panel is, how can we better prepare young people for the job market post-COVID? Munira Wilson, we'll start with you on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. So, as you say, young people who are at the start of their careers or just entering the job markets have been disproportionately impacted. I think I saw one stat that showed an increase in unemployment and benefit claimants among 18 to 24-year-olds having increased by 124%. In the last year, which is really shocking. And we've got to remember as well that a lot of young people are working in sectors that have been worst hit by the pandemic. So, lots of students obviously work in hospitality or retail, etc., and holidays and weekends and evenings and whatnot. And a lot of them, as you say, whilst they have been disproportionately furloughed, many couldn't be furloughed because they're working in the gig economy and they're part of the 3 million excluded who frankly have been overlooked by government. So again, in terms of employment, I feel young people have really borne the brunt of this pandemic. In terms of how they can be better prepared for the job market, well, the thing that Liberal Democrats have been calling for is a massive investment in terms of a green investment package over several years. We want to see about £150 billion invested in green infrastructure, because that helps us with the twin issues of creating new highly skilled jobs, but also tackling the climate emergency. And for that, people have got to have the right skills, whether they're young people or older people. So that needs to come alongside a reskilling program. And we've talked about, you know, education is not just about school and university, it's about skills for life. And one of the things we've promoted is a skills wallet, which is £10,000 worth of skills investment over people's lifetimes for them to draw down at different times. That could be match funded by employers or councils. I would agree as well with what Zarah just said when she picked up the supplementary about reimagining education. The massive focus that we have in this country on exams, you know, we need to look at countries like Germany, where there's much greater focus on vocational qualifications, and actually they're seen with the same level of prestige as academic qualifications. And I'd love to see a real culture change in this country whereby we are valuing vocational as much as the academic, and that's where we need to see, I think, much greater investment in apprenticeships and supporting apprenticeships. And it was great, actually, just a few weeks ago I spoke to a company in my constituency that supports the apprenticeship program, and talking to a young apprentice about how he actually, you know, all his careers advisors at school were talking to him about university next after school, and he was like, no, I don't want to go to university, I want to do an apprenticeship. And we've got to get away from that mindset and really focus on vocational skills and have the investment to go alongside that, and as I say, creating new jobs that will help to boost employment for young people.
Thanks, Munira. David Runciman, if we come to you next, what role do universities have here to ensure that students feel well equipped for the kind of working world post-COVID?
Yeah, so the question is what can be done to prepare young people for the job market? It puts it too much on the young people to be prepared. I mean, it should be what can be done to prepare the job market for young people, because the emphasis there is something, I mean, it's grim and it's going to get grimmer. I mean, that's the other thing. I think this is an area where I think it is worth focusing on the last year, because there's a greater unemployment crisis to come. As the furlough scheme unwinds, unemployment is going to become a bigger issue in British politics, global politics, actually, I suspect. There's going to be a lot of structural adjustment. Young people have borne the brunt of it this year because they're at the most fragile end of the job market, most expendable end. That's likely to get lost in the mix as unemployment becomes a bigger issue and it moves up the chain. And you know, the idea that then it's for young people to adapt in those circumstances, and I think it does get, I mean, I'm slightly switching topic here, but it does get to an issue which is so central to what you're about and what this is about, which is young people are underrepresented in our politics. And it's very easy for, you know, when something moves from being a young person's issue to a general issue, the particular strain on young people to get lost. And this is somewhere where I don't think it is on, you know, universities could do more. I tend to agree. We shouldn't think of university as the entryway into this wonderful, actually grim new working environment. We need to be much more flexible and open. Universities need to think really hard, connects to the previous question about how to reimagine education for the 21st century. Our educational provision across the board is way too 20th century for the 21st century. But it should, I think the question is the wrong way around. I think there is a bigger issue here. And I think on this one, on unemployment, young people have suffered more this year. And I suspect in a year or two's time, that will be forgotten when other people start to suffer. And it shouldn't be forgotten. And one of the reasons it will be forgotten is our politics does not have enough young people's voices in it.
David, thank you. A lot of interesting thoughts there. Ross Greer, your thoughts on this?
David's absolutely right that it's far more about preparing the economy than preparing young people. We do, by international standards, a very good job in this country of preparing young people. There's loads that we need to improve on. Absolutely agree with what Munira was saying and Zarah was saying about, you know, we need to move away from this obsession with testing and that. It's a very warped version of academic rigor that we've got. But far more important now, as we look forward for the next kind of 5-10 years, is about how do we create these jobs? So we're coming out of one crisis, we're coming out of the pandemic, but we're still facing the far greater climate crisis. And the only way that we will tackle that crisis is by creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in the industries that will tackle it. So we know that we've got a housing crisis in all 4 parts of the UK. We need to have far more people in the construction industry building warm, affordable homes for people. We need to massively increase renewable energy infrastructure. We need to expand our railways. We need to be manufacturing more in this country so we're less reliant on international shipping. If the will is there from government to create those jobs, it can do it. I think the last year's really proven that government actually has the ability to make massive interventions in the economy for the collective good. And to do that at the moment, you would clearly need, the government would need to borrow. We should be reforming our tax system, but government would need to borrow. That's fine, because borrowing is really, really cheap and easy to do at the moment. We can't just leave this up to the market and say, oh, well, the market will create jobs where there are opportunities. No, that would be a complete failure of the state. It'd be a massive generational failure. We have an opportunity to create these jobs. We have a desperate, desperate need for the jobs that will tackle this next crisis, the climate crisis that's unfolding. We just need will from government to actually do that. And in terms of how it specifically affects young people, what we've got in Scotland is a youth guarantee. So for everyone 16 to 24, there's guaranteed either education, employment, or training for them. The Scottish Government have set that up, and it's great they've done that, and there's a level of ambition there, but we need to raise the ambitions for it. So the Scottish Government, I think the UK Government as well, would consider it a positive destination if a young person gets into a job that is a 0 hours contract on the minimum wage. That's not a positive destination. That's poverty pay, that's insecure, they're going to be stuck in private rented accommodation, they'll never get a mortgage on something like that. So we need to raise our standards, not just about the number of jobs that we create, but we need quality, lasting jobs that give people dignity and stability through their life. That's what young people deserve. And that work has to be put in now if we want that to be the case 5, 10, 15 years from now.
Ross, thank you. A lot of interesting thoughts as well there. We've got a few members of the audience that have raised their hands. Go to Josh first.
Hiya. So firstly, I just want to say thanks to all the panelists for coming out. My question, I don't mean to single them out here at all, but it's about the Scottish parliamentary elections that are upcoming. And as the only member of the opposition party that's here, it is mainly for Jamie Greene. But of course, anybody that wants to jump in is more than welcome to jump in. We've been told that this election that's coming up for Scotland is one of the most important in recent times, and is essentially a decision between independence and pursuing that or not. And the Conservatives have often conveyed the message that the SNP are an independence party and that they're only for independence and they have no other policies. From the leaflets that have came through my door, funnily enough, the only leaflet that's came through my door that seems to have one policy on it and seems to be focused on independence is the Scottish Conservative leaflet. And I'm just wondering how you're convincing young people to vote for you when all you're doing is slandering the party that's been in power, when the young people are constantly told never to tear other people down and build upon them. How is the Scottish Conservatives trying to convince young people to vote for them if they're just attacking a one policy party by saying that they have one policy and it's to beat that party?
Okay, Josh, thanks for your question. Obviously, I can imagine I will come to the Conservatives on the panel. Just bear with me. And we have another participant that has raised their hand. David, so sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
It's all right. Yeah, hi. Just come back to what Ross was saying about jobs within the state sector, and I think he's right about that. But doesn't the panel agree that a windfall tax on the utility companies, IT companies and the banks to get a welfare to work programme for 1 million young people would be effective? But also, you come back to the teaching within our schools, shouldn't we also focus on the way we teach through, yes, not abolishing exams, but certainly reducing it, the quantity that our exams have? I think that'd be an effective way. But I think, Andrew Bowie was saying before, we've got to look beyond the pandemic. I think that's absolutely right. But one of the core ways, as I say, is through a windfall tax, but also it's creating a scheme for university graduates saying, if you come into the state sector and become a teacher, the state will pay you £45,000 a year, providing you teach in an inner city school with low standards. That would be something to look on. So I'd like to ask the panel, do they agree with any of this analysis, or am I just talking piffle?
You're absolutely not talking people. No, I'm sure none of the panel members will say that. Lot to unpack there. We'll just move on back to the panel, and then we'll try and get round. Calvin Robinson, I suppose lot to unpack there. If you want to pick up on anything, but specifically, obviously, the question as well about preparing young people for the employment post-COVID.
Absolutely, and great point, Daud, by the way, on encouraging more teachers to join inner city schools with low standards. That's something that Teach First does really well, and we could see more of that across the nation. I just want to break apart this link between education and jobs that everyone seems to be kind of focusing on the fact that education is set up purely to get people jobs. It's a very utilitarian approach that I disagree with. I think there's been a lot of consensus on this panel, so I'd like to throw some challenges out there and introduce a bit of debate, especially towards Zarah, Munira and Ross, who all seem to agree that we have far too many exams. As a former teacher and assistant principal myself, I can tell you we're not over-tested or over-examined. Examinations are the best approach we have at introducing a level playing field. They give the best chance to, let me talk, no matter what background you come from, to give children equal opportunities. It's not perfect, but it's the best method we have available. And as Zarah said, it's not a conveyor belt. It's not a conveyor belt system, nor is it a utilitarian system to introduce jobs. It's not a job-making machine. Education is an end in and of itself. Passing on knowledge is the core principle behind education and cultural capital as well as knowledge. It's not about creating jobs. And someone mentioned, I think it was Ross, who said it's all right to borrow, it's a generational failure if we don't borrow more money. Saddling the next generation with debt is a generational failure. I think that's terrible economics. The government's job isn't to create jobs, that's the market, that is employers. We need to encourage and support employers and strengthen them to create jobs. Munira was right in that we need more options, and university is great for people who are academic, but we need more vocational options, such as apprenticeships and T-levels, which the Conservative government in England has been introducing. So that's great. We need more cultural change around how we perceive vocational options as an alternative to academic routes. I fully support that. But let's step away from this idea that education is just set up to give people jobs, and that the government's role is to give people jobs. That's all a very socialist nonsense.
Lot to unpack there, Karen. Thank you very much. Zarah, I suppose we'll come to you. There's a few comments there you might want to pick up on.
I hope I don't forget all the different comments. I'll pick up on the one about the education system. If we look at Scandinavian countries in particular, and we look at the way they run their education system, and we look at other markers of, happiness, mental health, young people's living standards and so forth, I think there's something to look at and something that we can definitely do better in. We have so many exams over the years that have been reduced. We used to have Key Stage 2 or Key Stage 1 in Year 2. We used to then have exams in Year 6, then we had them again in Year 9, then we had GCSEs, then we have A-levels. So some of those have been reduced, especially the Year 2 exams and Year 6 exams, but there are still exams that take place in Year 9, Year 10, and Year 11. All I'm saying is that we shouldn't rule out a new way of looking at the way we teach and we examine. There's ways, especially, if people are going into university, maybe we can have an exam then. Other countries do it, South Korea, where you just have this one exam across the entire country as people move into university. In America, they have the SATs as well. There's different ways of doing it. And I think it's definitely worth exploring options. And this pandemic has shown us, because when we were unable to take exams, and then we had a rigged algorithm that involved human biases playing out, where kids from state schools were disproportionately downgraded and private schools were disproportionately upgraded. I think that showed that now's the time to kind of step back and look at the way we're doing things. I want to touch on the point about the economy, because whenever we have economic crises, whether it's the financial crisis of 2008, the pandemic that we're going through now, and what is yet to come, young people are always disproportionately hit. And it's harder in an economy that is also characterized by precarious work, gig economy, and low wages. So rather than a point was made that we need to prepare the economy, I disagree. We need to change the economy. The economy that we currently have is not working for the vast majority of people. And the government has a kickstart scheme, and it's only reached 2,000 people out of 700,000 people that are unemployed. That's around 0.3% and pathetic in my humble opinion. So we need a proper plan to create these good quality, well-paid, unionized jobs for everyone, especially, you know, young people that are entering the job market. And there's several things that I would say that we need to do. And one of them is really simple. It's raising the minimum wage and making it the real living wage, because right now people are struggling and are having to work multiple jobs just to pay the bills and put food on the table. And it's actually super disgraceful, super unfair that a young person working in a job can get paid less than their older colleagues because of the way the national minimum wage is structured. So that needs to change. We also need to reverse anti-trade union laws that make it difficult for people to join a trade union, to fight for better working rights, terms and conditions. Because if you look at research again, higher levels of trade union membership correlate with higher wages and better living standards for all. So that's what we need to do. And then a point that Ross and Munira also made that I agree with is that while we are living through a crisis right now, there is the climate crisis, which is happening right now, and it's going to hit incredibly hard on us all, of course not equally, because working class communities, inner city communities, the global south will be disproportionately impacted and already are. So this is an opportunity for us to have a Green New Deal that creates these jobs for the future that are well paid, that are in the industries that we need them to be, in housing, making wind turbines, retrofitting homes, and actually we also need to place more value on jobs within the care service, because they are also green jobs. And I realize I am talking for way too long, but I just want to finish on this point, that in the pandemic, during the pandemic, we've had a conversation of what key workers are and how they keep society running. That's shop assistants, people working in care homes, nurses, and people who clean buildings and clean our streets, and the importance on cleanliness, especially in a public health crisis. We need to value those jobs. We need to invest in those jobs. We need to increase the wages in those jobs. After all, it's not, you know, hedge fund managers that keep society running. It's people working in those industries, and they are green jobs that we need to be supporting as well. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you, Zarah. A lot to unpack there. And you again, lots to unpack there. If we can just, with the original question about young people and how they can be better prepared for the kind of economy post-COVID, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks very much. God, there is a lot to unpack there. I was trying to remember what the original question was, but thanks for taking it back, Alan. And before I go on, and before I forget, Dowd's idea about, you know, paying teachers £45,000 if they choose to go and teach in inner city school. That's a fantastic idea. It's a variant on a theme of ideas that have been going through the mill for many years, but it's something that I think is definitely worth considering, and something that I think I will definitely take up with the Secretary of State for Education, because we need to look at how we empower people in the inner cities to aspire to really sort of give back. And if we can do that through encouraging some of our best and brightest graduates to go and teach in inner cities, and that's a great thing. So a fantastic idea. Look, and I want to go back to what Calvin said about exams. It's almost like what Churchill said about democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. Exams are the worst way of finding out your ability apart from all the others. I mean, I was one of the brightest kids in class who hated exams. I didn't do them. I didn't like them, and equally, I didn't want to go to university. And like a few other of the contributors have said today, you know, our focus on driving kids to university, if they're not academically minded, is something that we've got to get out of the habit of. You know, we've got to, one of the, to our great shame in Scotland, I think, it's Scottish Government at the time, one of the ways that we were able to supplement universities' income when the decision was taken not to implement tuition fees north of the border was to raid the further education budget. And we saw courses and classes slashed at colleges across the country. That is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. We need to make vocational training and courses just as valuable as a university degree. If a kid wants to go to university and they have the ability to go on a university and make success of it, that nothing should stand in their way. And I'm very proud that across the United Kingdom, and you know, I'm a Scottish Conservative, but as a part of the UK Conservative Party, I'm very proud now that if you're a child from a from a disadvantaged background, you've got more of a chance of getting to university in England than at any time in history. That's a record I think we should be proud of. And if you want to get to university, you should, and absolutely nothing in your way. We should, if you want to do that. But equally, if you don't want to go to university and you want to learn a vocational trade, or you want to go straight into the workplace, then we should be doing more to help you too. Zarah raised the numbers of people being assisted by the Kickstart scheme. The Kickstart scheme is a fantastic program. It's not helping enough people yet, and I would be the first to admit that. We need to look at what's going wrong in that and get it working properly. We need to invest much more in apprenticeships and encourage more companies to take on apprentices, because that's a great way into the workplace for young people. Calvin's absolutely right. It's not up to the state to create jobs, it's up to the market to create jobs. They do that very well, but it's up to the state to set the playing field, to give the support to companies to enable them to thrive and be productive, so that they can employ more people. And talking about the green agenda and investing in green jobs, one of the most transformative, one of the most exciting announcements made in the past couple of weeks by the UK government, certainly for somebody representing an Aberdeenshire seat in the north, where we've been almost wholly relying on the oil and gas sector for economic growth for the past 40 to 50 years, was the £16 billion transition deal that was announced just a couple of weeks ago. And this is a deal that's going to be investing in new jobs, investing in transitioning from fossil fuel industries into renewables, but working with the existing energy companies, working with your BPs, your Shells, your Totals, your smaller companies that are still exploring and drilling in the North Sea right now. That's how we maximize productivity. That's how we get investment in the green economy. And I'm very proud to represent a government that was the first in Europe to set a net zero target of 2050. I'm very proud that we are planning on reducing emissions by 68% in comparison to our 1990 levels. And I'm very proud that through the transition deal, we're going to be creating green jobs. And we need to do so much more. There's so much we could go into. We could go into exams, we could go into vocational training, we could go into the value of university education. So many things have been brought up. And I'd love to talk about them all night. But like a few other contributors, I realize I'm speaking a little bit too long. So I'll stop there. But it's fascinating to hear. Again, Dawood's idea is a great one.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Appreciate it. I keep saying a lot to unpack there. We need to find a new phrase. Munira Wilson, we'll just come back to you briefly, if you don't mind, and Ross Greer. Calvin obviously did mention both of you by name. I suppose I should come back to you on this.
Yeah, if I may, thank you. I just wanted to pick up a few points that both Calvin and Andrew have just made. So on exams, I've never advocated getting rid of exams altogether. I just think we need much more of a mixed model. And Calvin, I appreciate you said that you used to be a teacher. Well, I speak to teachers and head teachers in my constituency all the time. And many of them are also of the view that you need a mixture of assessment methods. Different children learn and show how their abilities and talents in very, very different ways. I happen to be somebody who was pretty good at memorizing stuff and regurgitating it in an exam, and therefore did really well in exams and got to a great university. My husband, I would argue, was far brighter than I am, but was crap at exams and really, really struggled. And he's got a master's degree, I haven't. So I think, this idea that there is only one way to assess children and young people, I think really needs to be thrown out the water. And most importantly, the pressure that is put upon children and young people as a result of this huge focus on exams is why we've got the children's mental health crisis in this country that we have, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic for a whole host of reasons, one of which, talking to young people in my constituency, is because of the anxiety around, are we going to have exams? Are we not going to have exams? How are they going to be assessed? So, and because I happen to live in I represent a constituency where it is pretty affluent, middle class, there's a lot of parental pressure. We have a higher than average sort of risky behaviours going on in this borough because of some of the anxiety that's caused. So we have to look at the impact that it has on emotional and mental well-being. Just to pick up on the point about being socialist by getting the government to create jobs. Look, I'm a liberal. I am not a socialist by any stretch of the imagination, and I would far rather the market is creating jobs. We find ourselves in an unprecedented circumstance right now, which is why the government has had to step in with the kind of heavy interventions that we've seen, that many of us would feel uncomfortable with in all sorts of ways. And therefore, as we come out of it, we can't just let the market suddenly take over again. There has got to be that continued investment from government as we slowly creep our way out of this. And it is important that government provides the incentives and the investment for the private sector to be able to create some of those jobs, which is why I'm so dismayed that this government has scrapped its industrial strategy, which was put in place, first of all, by my predecessor, Vince Cable, in the coalition government, and actually Theresa May continued and built on. And being from the life sciences sector before I got into politics, before I got into Parliament rather, the life sciences industrial strategy was actually really brilliant. And that's just been scrapped, and the Industry Council has been scrapped. And to Andrew crowing about how much this government has done on the green agenda, well, it had to be dragged kicking and screaming to review the idea to invest in a new coal mine in this country, thanks to Liberal Democrat MP in Cumbria, Tim Farron. Just in the last week, it's scrapped 2 green initiatives, including the Green Homes Grant and another green incentive scheme that's given to businesses. So I think there's a lot to be desired in terms of the Tories and the environmental agenda.
Munira, thank you very much. Russ Greer, briefly, if you would, I just want to go to the audience, if that's okay, but briefly, if you would come in.
Yeah, well, I am a socialist, and I will happily, proudly take on that label. If we leave it up to the market, what we'll end up with is the economy that Zarah talked about. We'll end up going back to the old economy where you have hundreds of thousands of young people working in insecure jobs for poverty wages with exploitative bosses. The market is not some panacea. It's not goodwill. It's a series of companies whose job is to make profit, not to provide social good. What we have at the moment is socialism for the rich and for corporations, not for the rest of us. These companies can pay their staff below the minimum amount you need to live on, and that is then subsidised by everyone else through the social security system, or what's left of the social security system after the Tories have spent a decade hacking it apart, partly with the help of the Liberals. But to very briefly finish on the point around exams, I mean, Calvin is just wrong on that one. There is huge amounts of international evidence that exams are not the best way to assess young people's attainment, their abilities, their knowledge. They're a snapshot in time. And they actually do the opposite of what he claimed. They're not a great leveler. They massively advantage young people from stable middle-class backgrounds, the young people least likely to have issues around stuff like anxiety. We know from countries like Finland that continuous assessment by teachers to a high professional standard throughout the year provides a much, much more accurate reflection of young people's genuine abilities, and it massively reduces the burden on their mental health. And we saw that as a result of the complete shambles with last year's replacement for the exams. What we did, in fact, it was the Greens who forced this in Scotland because the SNP are a minority government. We managed to get all the grades restored to what teachers had estimated for their pupils. As a result of that, more working class young people in Scotland have applied to university this year than at any previous year in our history, because teachers were finally able to make sure they got a grade that was a much better reflection of their general abilities, not how they performed in a 2 or 3 hour high pressure environment. Learning to pass an exam is completely different from actually learning the subject at school. And if we want to follow international best practice on this, we would be doing far, far fewer exams in this country.
Ross, thank you very much. We'll just go to the audience now. Peter, thank you very much for being patient. I know you've had your hand up for a while. Apologies I didn't bring you in sooner. Peter, your comments as an audience member at this point.
Yeah, all right, thank you. I'm sorry if this question's been asked before because I had to come in late. Apologies. But I was wondering what the panelists would make of the future of civil liberties coming out of the lockdown and freedoms generally. I'm actually involved in, I'm not the primary person, but I'm involved in setting up the Oxford Civil Liberties Society at the moment. We're trying to kind of explore these issues, and I just find it interesting as well, because I suppose Calvin's take on, you know, what the most important freedoms are to preserve and promote, and the threats coming in would be so very different to Zarah's, although I think she's just left. but I suppose they both agree that there is very much an issue with liberties and freedoms at the moment, and that has huge ramifications. So I was wondering what panelists were thinking of this huge issue at the moment.
Peter, thank you very much. We will go to the panel. Just want to get through some of the other audience members. Adil Hussein, you want to come in at this point?
Hi there, everyone. My question was more on the politics of climate. I'm a big fan of David's podcast, so I'd love to hear his answer on this. But a lot of young people are quite energized about the climate movement. We've seen from young people striking from school and other actions and local level activism that young people are really infused. And I wanted to know what the panel thinks the future of climate politics is, especially with a government that isn't very focused on climate issues. What do the panel see as climate politics having influence on electoral politics and just local level stuff too?
Thank you very much. Jamie Greene, we'll bring you in at this point, just before you move on to the next question. Ton of things there. Obviously, the original question was, preparing young people for the kind of employment post-COVID, but if you do want to pick up on any points briefly, more than welcome for you to do so.
Thank you for that. Yeah, no problem. Well, I mean, if you give me half an hour, I'll try and cover all the issues that have been raised. But I've actually got another hustings to go to as well, so I'll try and do what I can, and I'll happily pass the mantle on to my colleague Andrew to take all the difficult questions on trust in politicians and the climate emergency. So I know he's nodding furiously. I'll tell you what I'll do. First of all, is I'll tackle the question. I think it was from Josh. Apologies, my screen was blank. About the forthcoming Scottish election. I mean, first of all, I want to say that it's great that people are now talking about the Scottish election. They're just around the corner. I know there are elections happening in other parts of the country, right across the UK as well. But I think events like tonight get people talking about politics, and young people need to get out and vote, whoever they vote for and whatever their views are. And judging by the nature of the question, I suspect Josh and I might be in slightly different sides of the coin in terms of Scottish politics. But I mean, to answer his question quite directly, I will happily stop talking about independence when Nicola Sturgeon stops talking about it. And it's as simple as that. I won't put it on any more leaflets. I won't talk about it in hustings. I won't talk about it on TV. I won't talk about it in the Scottish Parliament if she stops talking about it. Because I actually think I agree. I think we've got far more important things to be talking about. And the great conversation we're having tonight about exams, about the future of the economy, about the climate emergency, about equality, these are important issues that I'm really, really interested in. And anyone that's been following my political career over the last couple of years will know that I talk about these. When I was Shadow Transport Minister, I talked about green energy creation. When I was the Shadow Digital Minister, I talked about the lack of STEM teachers in our classrooms and the lack of focus on the industries of the future. And as Shadow Education Secretary, I've done nothing but talk about education. And I've got a raft of policies. I won't bore you with them all, but I could go through them because, I mean, there is an SNP government in Scotland who do want to talk about independence after the next election. And I disagree with that because I think we should be talking about how we recover as a country, not just Scotland, but how the whole of the UK recovers as a country from this awful pandemic. And I think education actually lies at the heart of that. She wants to be judged on a record by that. I could do a whole leaflet. I could do a whole book on Nicola Sturgeon's record in education, but I won't bore you again with that. So, let's put some of these positive policies at the heart of what we talk about. Let's, some of the other questions about civil liberties, about how we engage young people in politics, how we get them out to vote, how we get them excited about politics and start to make politics a much more positive thing. I want my leaflets to be talking about education. In fact, many of them do. I put that out there that I think we have more important things to be discussing as a parliament and as politicians in Scotland. So I set that gauntlet down. That's a challenge I put to the SNP. If you stop talking about it, so will I. Simple as that.
Jamie, thank you very much. We do have another question, which is particularly interesting, and I do want to get to it. I just will briefly bring in David Runciman at this point. Obviously, your podcast was mentioned, so I'd feel rude not to bring you in at this point, and then we'll go to Andrew briefly after that.
Thanks. So just very briefly on the two. So on the climate question, it does seem to me we don't talk often enough about the fact that there is a massive generational divide on this. So there's still lots of polling evidence. Young people think the climate issue is the #1 issue that we face. And as you go up the age scale, it goes down. There are lots of reasons why that might be, and it's shifting, public opinion is shifting. But in a democratic society where, and maybe we'll get onto this in the next section, where in elections, essentially, old people decide them. I mean, there are lots of reasons for unpacking that, as you would say, but you know, if you look at the electoral map of the last election, you would get a completely different country. We are two nations if it's the under 30s and the over 60s. And on climate, this is acute. And it's a reason for thinking about political representation as a central issue. Because if there is a huge generational divide in a political system that is skewed generationally, some things are not going to get the attention they need. And I think that's true of climate. Very briefly on civil liberties, it's a good question. So the thing that we haven't talked about, so we've lived through a pandemic. We're going through a jobs crisis. This is the age of climate change. In some ways, the biggest thing that is happening in our world is technology. I mean, technology is changing everything. And I think there are reasons to be worried about what's coming out of the pandemic. Not the kind of headline civil liberties question, not sort of old-fashioned lockdown and, you know, the police picking you up if you have a cup of coffee in the wrong place, but the myriad ways in which we probably don't, any of us, fully appreciate just how, not politics, but society is being restructured by new forms of communication and information. And it affects everything that we talk about, the economy, how we regulate industry, education, and so on. But it also has liberty implications too. I mean, I think sort of under the radar changes to our freedom are probably more important than the headline ones, but much, much easier to overlook.
David, thank you very much. Andrew, we'll come to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. It was very briefly, just to sort of come back on what Ardeel said about the politics of climate and how it's changing. And I would suggest that, you know, it actually changed a lot in the political sphere over an incredibly short period of time. When I was first elected in 2017, very few people actually brought up the climate within the chamber of the House of Commons or in debates that we were having. Now barely a week goes by when that's not a topic of debate, or at least brought up as part of a debate. And that's due to pressure being put on us as elected representatives from organisations like this one we're speaking at this evening, and other organisations around the country. I mean, I'm not, as you can imagine, Extinction Rebellion's biggest fan, but what they did was they brought that issue right into the heart of Westminster and demanded that we spoke about it and paid attention, and we did. And so that has changed a lot. And as I say, as somebody who represents part of the world heavily reliant on oil and gas, the change in that industry over the 4 short years I've been a member of Parliament, from being an industry that didn't want to talk about climate change at all because of the threat that that would mean to profits and all the rest of it, to a company that is out there shouting proudly about the changes that they're bringing in, making the North Sea the first net zero basin in the world, refusing to invest in new fossil fuel exploration, all the rest of it. So it has changed, and I say it's for the better. It's something that we have to talk, and we have to do more on. And I heard Munira saying that the Conservative Party, the Conservative government, hasn't done enough in the green agenda. Well, I think I would agree to a certain degree we can do more, but the fact that we've even gone as far as we have is down purely to the pressure that's being put on all elected representatives of all parties by organisations like the Youth Vote and others, Extinction Rebellion, all the rest of them around the country, however much I might disagree with their methods.
Andrew, thank you. A few raised hands. Angelica, we'll come to you. Your thoughts so far, and a question for the panel.
All right. Hi. So I had a quick question. So it was just mainly in terms of animal rights, because I know that's quite an important issue amongst young people these days, particularly as many sort of progress towards veganism and different ethical choices. So with the legislation we have at the moment, basically a lot of animals are being used. I think it was about 3.4 million animals in 2019 were used as part of scientific procedures. That ranges from experiments to, you know, genetic alterations. So I just want to know, are there any proposals to potentially reduce or eradicate the number of animals being used for scientific research purposes? Will you look at potentially strengthening the current legislation What are your thoughts on that side of things? It is quite an important issue. And just in the back of that, even with regards to the COVID vaccination, because that is quite a recent issue as well, a lot of animals were used in phase 1 of the testing. So many people are sort of reluctant to take that vaccinations or vaccinations that are being offered due to ethical reasons. So will there be an alternative? Because obviously we all want to be, we all want to see the back end of COVID pretty much, and we don't want that to remain and to influence our lives, but there are still ethical concerns. So what would you say in response to that? And the second question, actually, just whilst I'm here, so the other question I have is in the back of education, because we're all talking about the education system, etc. From what I've noticed, because I have worked as a teacher in the past, a lot of young people are really, really stressed in terms of exams, and I know we've touched upon this, but their exams and the stress it's causing them because they're not getting into certain courses, and basically they want to enter into different, they're looking to pursue education for the purposes of a career. But should our focus not really be centralised on why are we pursuing education? Should it be for a career, or should it be because we want to pursue further knowledge? So should we not be looking at why we're doing things and really focusing on that within our schools and our education system? And that would potentially reduce even the number of mental health difficulties that young people are facing. So that's me. I'll mute myself.
Angelica, thank you very much. I will just go to other audience members, and I'm sure the panel will pick up on various points. Josh, we'll come back to you just briefly, though. I have to say we do need to move on to the final question. Josh?
Yeah, that's fine. I just want to kind of, before I say the question, just say that, Jamie, you have picked me up right. I am on the opposite side of the scale. And I know that me and Jamie could sit here and debate independence until we're both blue in the face, so I will keep it short and sweet. It's just the fact that Jamie said that him and his party will stop talking about independence when Nicola Sturgeon stops talking about independence. Now, I don't know if Jamie tuned in to the leaders' debate on the BBC last week, but the numbers showed that Nicola Sturgeon mentioned independence in an independence referendum a fraction of times than that compared to the amount that the leader of your party actually mentioned it. And it seems awfully like Douglas Ross is obsessed with the idea of independence and the idea of stopping it, when Nicola Sturgeon has said point blank that she will not have another independence referendum until we see the back of the coronavirus pandemic.
Josh, thank you very much. We will move on to the final question. So this year, young people have become more and more vocal about their frustrations on a whole range of issues. We've obviously seen Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, etc. But why is this frustration not translated into voter turnout? David, obviously you alluded to the fact that young people aren't still voting. So do young people not trust our political system? David, we'll start with you on this. Do young people not trust our political system?
I think there's a danger in making it all about trust. But I think there are reasons. So the thing that annoys me is it is true that turnout is higher among older voters than younger voters. That is true. Again, as you go up the age scale. And so you sometimes hear the argument, well, if young people voted in the numbers that older people voted, electoral outcomes would be different. They wouldn't, actually, because there aren't enough young people. That's the trouble. And we're seeing more and more, and this is not a political point, this is a demographic point. We live in very different societies than we did 20 or 30 years ago. Our democracy is still the same. And it's been shown this year in the pandemic. So this is a disease that affects primarily people over age 70 or 80. Now, if this disease had struck 50 years ago, it would have had a completely different impact. And we've seen it in countries that have a much lower median age. Our society is geared towards the welfare of older people, rightly on this issue, completely rightly. There's no choice. You have to protect people's lives. But young people pay the price of that in an electoral system where they are massively disadvantaged. I mean, it just is a fact. 50 years ago, the 20s, 30s and 40s outnumbered the 50s, 60s and 70s. It's not true anymore. And it's not a party political point by any means, but I think it is a really important feature of our politics. If elections are always being lost partly because you are outnumbered, you will be frustrated. And I actually think that all of the different ways in which young people express that frustration is still all part of democracy, and it's healthy and good. Street politics is democratic politics, protest politics is democratic politics. If anything, just as we're too fixated on exams, we're too fixated on elections. We think elections are the only means of achieving change. They're not. I mean, in many ways, they're sometimes the least effective means of achieving change. But I don't think young people have lost trust in democracy. There is some evidence that around the world, young people are the most mistrustful of these systems, but I think that's cyclical and will likely change. If you ask people about democracy as a whole, most people still have a lot of faith in it as the best way to, particularly to change politics. But if you just think about, this is the last thing I'll say, if you think about our way of doing politics, and if you think about what's changed in the world in the last 30 years, and you think about how much has changed in just how we do politics institutionally and how little it has changed. If you've only been alive for the last 30 years and you've seen all of the changes going on around you, and politics seems, it's not broken, I don't think it's broken at all, but it's sort of frozen. I think there's good reason to believe that something's got to give. And I think something will give coming out of this pandemic. But I don't think young people should be accused of having lost trust in this system. I think they are entitled to have deep frustrations with it.
David, thank you. Andrew, your thoughts. Do young people not trust the political system?
I honestly, I don't know. If I'm honest, if they don't, then I think they should. But there is absolutely a problem with young voter turnout in this country, or that there is no doubt. And we have to examine the reasons for that. It's interesting. We've actually got the youngest House of Commons, I think, almost in history. Certainly on our benches, on the Conservative benches. I sort of took a snapshot of the Conservative Party I was elected into in 2017, and you compare it to the Conservative Party now. We've got two MPs who are 25 years old. I was one of the youngest when I got elected. I was 30. Now I'm looked at as being over the hill, and I'm only 33. And that's because there are so many young voices in the House of Commons now, which is great because we're now talking about issues that we simply weren't talking about before. And hopefully that will mean that more young people will be engaged in what we do in Parliament, and therefore be more engaged in the electoral process, because you can achieve change through politics. I think young people today are more engaged in politics, more aware of issues than ever before. I mean, we've already spoken about the climate, but on so many other issues, Black Lives Matter, or whether it's, in fact, you name it. I mean, Scottish independence, the Brexit issue. Young people are incredibly engaged with what's going on in the world, and they're incredibly vocal about the change that they want to see. But when it comes to actually getting them to turn out and vote, that's where, for some reason, the relationship breaks down. Now, it's not a new thing. Young people have always been less likely to vote than their older peers. But it is something that does seem to be getting worse, and it's something that we should look at addressing. But to the question, do I think that there's a lack of trust from young people in politics? I honestly don't know the answer to that. All I know is that we need to do more to encourage people to vote. And saying that they're not interested in politics is completely for the birds.
Thank you very much. Munira Wilson.
Thanks. So on the trust in politics question, I actually found earlier today a really interesting paper commissioned by the John Smith Centre with the University of Glasgow, where they did some research on this. And actually they found, relative to other age groups, there was actually a reasonably high level of trust amongst young people in both government and in their local MP. I say that with a strong caveat of relative to other groups, in that across the population, there generally isn't a great deal of trust, but relative to other age groups, actually, the 18 to 24-year-olds showed quite a high degree of trust, which I thought was really interesting and sort of flies in the face of what we've heard today about voter turnout. To respond to what David said about, well, actually elections are often the least effective way of achieving change, and Andrew wondering why we don't have more young people turning out. I mean, one way to change that, frankly, is first of all introducing votes at 16. If you can join the army and get married and do all sorts of other things and pay taxes at 16, why on earth can't you vote for governments that will affect those policies? But just as importantly, we need electoral reform so that people's voices are genuinely heard. I mean, the fact that we've got such a skewed electoral system where our entire government, often, you know, with massive majorities as we see at the moment, where they're able to pretty much ride roughshod over whatever public opinion is on any given issue, is because there's a, you know, small number of seats across the country that decide what the colour of the government is. And if we had a proportional system, I think, and with votes at 16, I think young people would feel much more empowered, as if they've got much more influence in terms of the political process, and I think would be much more likely to turn out. And I think it would also focus politicians' minds on making sure that they're speaking to the needs of every part of the electorate, not just the older generations.
Munira, thank you very much. I will go to the audience now. I'm just conscious of time. Apologies to the other panel members if I don't get to you. We'll just ensure we get some audience thoughts. Sam Ward, we'll go to you first.
Hi. So I kind of wanted to further establish on David's point about how I think there is a bit of a misconception, and it's dangerous to say that the youth aren't interested in politics. We are. Black Lives Matter, you know, tackling climate change. The youth are really engaged in politics. Where they're not engaged, and I think this is addressed to all the panelists from political parties, is actually within parties themselves. So I want to hear what the panelists believe and how they can get the youth into their own parties to affect policies there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah. Interesting question. I think there's some background. Anish, we'll come to you next. Your thoughts or comments?
Yeah, hi there. So I was going to say that, you know, our democracy is actually far from perfect. So if you look at the 2019 election, only 67% of people who were eligible to vote actually came to turn out to vote. So that's like 33% who just, I don't know, either spoiled their ballot, or I'm not sure if that's part of it, or just didn't go to vote at all. And another problem is, I agree with Munira Wilson, I think the Lib Dem MP, you know, so the Conservative Party, they got 43% of the vote share, but they're in government, that nobody else is in government, none of the other parties. So everyone else who had a say in that election, none of their policies are catered for at all. And so, yeah, I think we need to go to a PR system or something like that. And, you know, I think politics is the main way to change things. So like protests, Extinction Rebellion, BLM, they're all good to raise awareness. But at the end of the day, it's the government that implements the change, the legislation. So that's the most important thing. So getting young people to go and vote is essential, probably the most important. Politics is the most important thing for change in society.
Thanks very much. And Dawood, come to you as well.
There we go. Thanks. I was going to say 3 points about this. The first is, you know, one of the ways you can get young people back into politics is by teaching it effectively. You know, we teach sport as a very effective thing, quite rightly, but we should also put politics on that same level, because if we have that ingrained belief from a young age that politics, voting, democracy is important, you get a long-term form of less young people being apathetic. Secondly, I think when you have democratic votes, politicians should be required to respect the democratic vote, no matter what it is. And I think that's another thing to get young people back into politics, that they know that politicians will implement any outcome, whether a general election or a referendum. And thirdly, I think, yes, definitely lower the voting age to 16 immediately. I think that's a great idea. But also, it's having policies that work with young people. And I think this is where the Conservative Party failed in abolishing EMA, abolishing maintenance grants. But young people want a sense of realism in that things can be done. Because, of course, we're idealists, but we also want to make sure that things can be done properly. And I think if politicians, instead of doing formula speak, actually answer the question properly, straight answers, and showed a solution, then they'd be more likely to get young people back into politics. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Kamal, we will come to you. Just bear with me. I just want to get around the panel briefly. Russ Greer, really briefly on this, you know, as a politician yourself,
what can be done to work on trust in politics amongst young people?
Yeah, Votes at 16 is coming for the UK. We've had Votes at 16 in Scotland since 2014. I actually led the campaign for that before I was a politician. It was an amazing success in our referendum, so successful that it's now permanent for Scottish Parliament and local elections. Even the Conservatives here support it. They acknowledged it was a big success. The Welsh parliamentary elections next month will be the first there to have Votes at 16. This is happening across the UK. Of course, the current UK government don't want it to happen because the Conservatives don't do particularly well with the youngest voters. It's a self-interest thing, but it is going to happen sooner or later. And that touches on Dad's point about teaching this in schools. We saw that when we lowered the voting age to 16 in Scotland, was schools took on a fantastic responsibility at making sure that their young people were registered to vote, that we were having these debates. Like, the best hustings I've ever done have all been in schools where young people felt really empowered. They felt confident challenging the politicians on the panel. It just works. Votes at 16 doesn't just empower 16, 17-year-olds. It starts people off with their first experience of democratic politics in a way that makes them more likely to vote when they're 18 or 20 or whatever. But I mean, Munira is absolutely right about changing the electoral system as well. The vast majority of people in this country live in seats that do not affect the outcome of UK general elections. Why would you feel empowered to participate in a system like that? Compare that to the parliament I'm in, where the governing party got a minority of the vote. So they are a minority of the parliament. They need to rely on other parties to get anything passed. In many cases, that means relying on the Greens. So we've used that to deliver for young people. Every young person in Scotland will be able to use the bus for free. Everyone under 22 will be able to use the bus for free from this summer because the Greens wrote that into the last national budget. That's what happens when you have proportional representation, when you have Votes at 16, when you have parties that actually both want to, but also need to represent the interests of young people. It's not perfect. Scottish Parliament's not perfect. I don't think we do nearly as good enough a job as we could at representing young people, but there's a massive difference between alienation and apathy. I think young people across the country feel pretty alienated by a lot of our institutions. They don't feel apathetic about the issues. That should be abundantly clear. And if it's not electoral politics that's for you, join a trade union. That is an incredibly powerful way to get involved in politics and to make change that is in your material interest as well as everyone around you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Kamal, we'll come to you. I'm just conscious we want to get to the audience as much as possible before we finish.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say the idea of young people's trusting the political system. I think they've got a really wide interest in politics, obviously, but the question is, why has it taken a pandemic to raise their issues? And obviously, if their votes don't get heard, why would they trust the political system exactly?
Thanks very much, Kamal. So we have come to the end of the event. Lots of interesting things that were discussed, and the youth vote is going to continue to try and be the champion of young people, and we will be continuing to work with lots of politicians, not just on this panel, but that aren't here to ensure that young people feel like their voice is heard. Sabine, who's our head of campaigns and PR, has just got a kind of final message to everyone, and then we will wrap up.
Hi everyone, just to say a massive thank you to all our panelists for taking the time to join us tonight, and to Alex for mediating, and the whole events team at Youth Vote for making tonight possible. We also would like to extend our thank you to our sponsors for tonight's event. Jimmy's Iced Coffee have very kindly agreed to provide everyone here with 2 delicious 3 cans of iced coffee. And Branded No Name are offering a 25% discount on their selected items. So we will be sending an email out shortly with the links. All you have to do is fill in your details and the cans will be posted to you free of charge. And also, whilst you're at it, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Insta, all that good stuff at the Youth Vote UK. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Sabine. And we'll try and make